The South African Depression and Anxiety Group estimates that 23 people take their own lives in South Africa daily, and for every one of them, there are at least 20 attempted suicides. Men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women. This week, the news of local hip-hop star Riky Rick's death, who was also outspoken about his mental health and chronic depression, came as a shock to many. Well, we're joined by clinical psychologist Sikander, Kalla, and Pan-African Psychology Union President Dr. Saths to discuss this issue further tonight. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time. It's been interesting to watch the various reactions to the passing of Riky Rick, particularly by his fans, people who followed his music, his life, and he's seen as somebody who was a trailblazer and doing incredibly well in his career. And many people have been struggling to understand why somebody who looks as successful as he has been would take their own lives. Perhaps, Dr. Cooper, let me begin with you and talk about how can we begin to make sense of something like this, especially for those who do not and have not suffered from depression.
Well, look, suicide is something that is an event, very tragic, very final, that can impact everyone, can impact any culture, any religion, gender, class, or country. And there are different bases for it. The statistic you gave is one that is actually a little old, and it's from 2019, where the World Population Development surveys show, interestingly, Kathy, that Lesotho leads with 72 plus per 100,000, and Eswatini is third with 29 plus, and South Africa is 10th with 23, but Russia beats us with 25. Now, if you link that to the depression rates, you'll see Russia still there, but the countries I've mentioned, our Southern African countries, don't feature, and that's because we don't deal with this link. Depression and suicide. Now, while Riky Rick has been very accomplished and so on, depression is something that is an underlying factor in suicide. You cannot rule that out, and there is a high risk of depression developing into other forms of with morbidity, and then the person suicides. Now, I don't want to deal with the Riky Rick phenomenon in particular, but I wish to say that we are at high risk in our country, and any kind of intervention, and I laud the kind of work done by SADAG and other groups, but what we do need is a systemic reevaluation of our mental health, and that is not going to be done by individuals or by individual psychologists or groups like SADAG. It needs conditions to change, and the statistics that impact our people, particularly during COVID, are stark. The unemployment, the sense of hopelessness, the helplessness, and very little light at the end of the tunnel. And Riky Rick was very outspoken about some of the issues affecting artists. He was out there doing stuff, and he's a classic example of a role model who can be impacted, and this is something which I think we need to take great care over, and the policymakers in government, in the departments of health and other areas need to step up their game to be able to control what I think is an epidemic in our country and needs to be curtailed.
Sikander, when we pay close attention to the gender differentials and men being 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, one of the things that comes to mind is the number of murder-suicides that we see taking place in our country, especially of those who perhaps work as police officers and who are in other very highly stressful professions. Why is it that there's such underreporting and perhaps not very much recognition of how men are affected by depression as well?
I think that's a phenomenal question, because we've seen it time and time again. You know, I think back to the tragic Tembisa Hospital incident that occurred very recently, of which I was involved in assisting there. I think we've seen this so many times, and it's really an established pattern, and it's rightfully so to ask the question, why is this happening? You know, we can talk about the underreporting, but I think going beyond why is there an underreporting, which I always draw reference to hegemonic masculinity, in which men have been conditioned, consciously and subconsciously, to suffer in silence on some level. And we need to think about the language that we use in how we communicate our difficulties, that sometimes there's a lack of platform for the vulnerability to express some of the difficulties. And I think Dr. Cooper unpacked that perfectly, in the sense of it's such a systemic issue that is multifaceted, but there's a top level aspect to it, there's a bottom level aspect to it, but it's really pervasive in our society. And I think in the sentiment of suffering in silence, I think the pressures, the systemic, the structural factors have increased tremendously. I think one statistic that has really stuck out to me is, before the pandemic, SADAG was receiving about 600 calls per day. And since the pandemic hit and lockdown hit, they've gone to more than 2,000 calls per day. And I think that's very telling about the structural factors that are at play. In the jobs that you've mentioned, law enforcement, what have you, there's constant trauma, there's constant difficulties there as well. There's also sentiments of being under-resourced and no platform to voice that out, because men are not supposed to express those difficulties. And we see that resulting in repression, suppression, and avoidance of all of those internal emotions. And when it ends up then coming to fruition, it's explosive. And I think we also see that in the more lethal means that men utilize when it comes to attempting suicide. Also, at the same time, substance use plays a massive role as well, where we try to numb our emotions. And we've seen also in the lockdown period just the relationship that a lot of South Africans have towards substance use, and the dependency that is quite prominent in our society as well. So I think you need to look at it holistically and see how we can unlearn and relearn certain things, and how all stakeholders in society can come together to play their part.
Dr. Cooper, there will be a generation, particularly again, of young men that looked up to somebody like Riky Rick as an icon, and who could well feel traumatized by his passing. What would you say to them tonight? And perhaps they too may be facing whatever internal and psychological issues.
Well, that they should look at his life, look at his contributions, and take up the cudgels on his behalf, so that his life is not in vain, that lives that are lost through suicide and other violence in this society, which is one where we have the highest rates of violence outside of a country being at war. You know, the violence statistics and, the GBV statistics, the statistics of children getting injured and killed, they're very high. It is something that men need to stand up, be counted, and say, let's break this chain. Let's do something that's positive. And there are kinds of activities that they can participate in to ensure that they don't become statistics as well. They need to actually relook at the life that's been lost and how they can make a serious memorialization for themselves and for their future, because they will be feeling very sad, very depressed, very vulnerable, and feel that there's despair. But really, their life is about living. There are great things happening out there. There are things that, despite what's happening in our country, that level of psychic emergency can and must change to psychic energy, to be able to do things for oneself, those around us, and particularly younger people, children in our midst. So we can do it. We can change things in our society.
And Sikander, let me then just wrap it up with you and talk about, the question of access. How much of that is a barrier to doing what Dr. Cooper is saying, to reaching out, to, going and being part of, whether it's communities or platforms where it's easy to have these conversations?
Yeah, that's a massive question, because we first say we need to endorse a place where we communicate vulnerably so that we don't suffer in silence. But once we're communicating in more authentic, vulnerable, congruent ways, where are the platforms to catch us and guide us and assist us? And I think that's why I drew reference to all stakeholders in society creating platforms. It can't fall on SADAG. It can't fall on cohesive collaboration. It can't fall on other organizations. It needs to be a wide-reaching societal stance that all of us have a role to play. The individuals, the communities, and even the corporate entities, the governmental entities, all these individuals need to come together and say, let's create platforms in all aspects of mental health, from addiction and substance use difficulties, depression, anxiety, all of it. And I also think in creating psychoeducation campaigns where we realize we need to improve the ways in which we communicate about mental health difficulties. We shouldn't see high functioning as mutually exclusive to depression. And I think that was the case of Riky Rick. That was a shock to so many, because here was someone full of life and high functioning. But that's not mutually exclusive with depression and other mental health difficulties. So I think it will be an approach that must permeate through language, societal structures, cultural structures, political structures, and the whole of society.
Let me thank you both for your time tonight. Clinical psychologist Sikander Kalla and president of the Pan-African Psychology Union, Dr. Saths Cooper. And of course, for anyone needing help, please get in touch with the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, SADAG. That's on 0800 567 657. The helpline is operational for 24 hours a day.